Welcome to the GENXYZ Podcast. Today it's just me, Micah, and we wanted to roll out a quick episode on the new Ukraine Aid Package bill that just passed the House and the Senate and signed by President Biden 24 April 2024. Let's get into it. All right, this is the breakdown for the $95 billion military aid package to Ukraine, but it's not all going to just Ukraine. $26 billion is going to Israel, and some of that is humanitarian relief to the citizens or open-air prisoners in Gaza. And $8 billion is going to Taiwan to counter Chinese threats in the Indo-Pacific. So lots of military timely investments. And to quote our fearless Senate leadership, there could be dire consequences for the U.S. and many of its global allies if Russian President Putin's aggression is left unchecked. So there you have it. The one thing that the Republican and Democratic leadership agree on is more war. So there you have it. What I thought was interesting, though, was the vote was split 1/3 in the House, and that was 311 to 112. So if you remember back to the original start of the Ukraine-Russian war, the first aid package, and I think we're up to now 158 million or something like that. It was almost unanimous across the board voting for that relief package for Ukraine. Now it's becoming more of a contentious topic as there's proponents for spending that money elsewhere, and obviously we have no shortages of problem to spend taxpayer dollars on. So what does $61 billion get you in Ukraine? In short, 7 months of defensive operations. You can't mount an offensive counterattack with this funding. It's really not a financial problem. Ukraine does not have the soldiers to conduct a counter-offensive this summer. And so this aid package is primarily air defense weaponry and long-range artillery capabilities. So they definitely need the air defense because they're getting slaughtered by Russians' air attacks. The long-range artillery capabilities, this is not necessarily a surprise. We knew they were going to get ATACMS. Rumor is the ATACMS were already there. So how that works, I don't know. Vote on the bill and then miraculously ATACMS show up the next week. But that long-range artillery capability is advantageous because it can go range 300 kilometers. So it means they can launch from well behind their defensive front, so they can protect those resources, and they can strike targets deep into Russian territory. So what could go wrong? So one of my most favorite questions from the previous episode, our first installment on the Ukraine series, was actually from a good friend of mine who is still living in Europe. And he asks, do you Americans really think that Ukraine can win this war against Russia? It's an outstanding question because it really depends on how you define winning. If you define winning as President Zelensky has stated, winning for the Ukrainians is pushing the Russians back, claiming their territory in eastern Ukraine, and also claiming their territory, Crimea. Now, as I stated, they don't have the human capital. They don't have the soldiers to conduct that offensive operation. And by my simple army major math, if a defense is $65 or $61 billion, offensive operations would be at least 180 that they would need to restock their supplies to conduct offensive operations. But it doesn't even matter. They don't have the human capital, the soldiers to conduct that those operations. But if you look at this funding bill, if Ukraine can stall the Russian advance and prevent the Russians from invading Eastern Europe, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, and prevent Russia from taking more territory in Ukraine, I would consider that a win because President Putin is also outstretched. He's been making territorial gains because he's investing heavily. Last numbers I heard was 12% of their GDP is going to this Ukrainian Russian war effort. And they're also pulling 30,000 soldiers out of their prison systems to backfill losses on the front lines. So Putin really doesn't have the capacity to move into Eastern Europe. He can barely handle what they have right now, and I would argue they're going to have a tough time taking the rest of Ukraine. Obviously, now that Ukrainians have received this aid package, it doesn't look like there's going to be a swift offensive victory for Putin this summer as they kind of enter the next fighting season. So what do I believe this bill really buys Ukraine? Well, it buys Ukraine and the West time to negotiate from a position of strength. So overall, the best possible outcome we can hope from this is a negotiated settlement between Russia and Ukraine. They both don't have the offensive capabilities to knock each other out. So yes, this is now prolonged. But the best possible outcome is reaching a negotiated settlement between Russia and Ukraine. Overall, this is bad news for Putin, who was counting on the West to have war fatigue and move their attention elsewhere, like Gaza, Israel, and obviously, focusing in the Indo-Pacific as well. So, but Senate bipartisan leadership made passing this bill a huge priority, and I thought it was also interesting that Speaker Johnson took considerable risk, political risk, to take this bill forward to a vote, even getting his speakership threatened. This is all key indicators that U.S. and its allies are not changing direction on long-term support for Ukraine and its allies. So buckle up, because we're far from over with this money train going to Ukraine. But this Ukraine aid package is not all bad. There's some interesting stuff included. So the Ukrainian aid package includes a $9 billion economic assistance to Ukraine in the form of forgivable loans for any previous aid provided. So not a surprise if you were thinking we were getting any of those billions back from Ukraine. I would also think in the future, the reconstruction costs, once we do reach a settlement and stop this war, the reconstruction costs in Ukraine are going to be insane. But the bill includes a provision that allows the U.S. to seize frozen Russian central bank assets, which they've already done. This bill gives them a pathway to use those funds from Russia to rebuild Ukraine. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Also included in the bill were the capability to impose sanctions on nations and other actors that traffic fentanyl. Why it took so long for this to happen, that's kind of frustrating. It's very clear that fentanyl is being weaponized against America and is causing all sorts of problems. I believe over 250,000 Americans have lost their lives, and how many countless others have suffered from addiction and had their lives ruined from fentanyl. They were able to get the TikTok ban, or getting BitDance, the Chinese company that owns TikTok, to divest and sell off to a non-Chinese company and not host those servers in China where they're used for intelligence gathering operations against Americans and the rest of the world. That is going to be very interesting to see how that develops. I would be very surprised if they shut the doors on TikTok. Be very curious to see how China gets around that as they really leverage that to collect information. Here are my closing thoughts. Regardless of whether you agree with the Ukrainian aid package or not, history is going to look back on this conflict as being the largest event of our millennia, due to the tremendous human cost, the death toll, and the geopolitical impacts and all the mass migration that this has caused. So there's a lot of impacts that we have right now. There's also going to be large unforeseen impacts. But let's start with the current death toll and mass migration stats. The BBC just reported that Russia surpassed 50,000 deaths, which is 8 times the official public acknowledgement from Russia. Ukraine claims 31,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed, also understated, but it is within the best interests of both Ukraine and Russia to underreport those losses for obvious reasons. Estimates based on U.S. intelligence suggest much greater losses. If I'm reading any number coming out of the Kremlin, I would add a zero to it. So if we use that math, you're looking at 500 million people losing their lives in this war, and that's absolutely that's ridiculous. Further, the mass migration of 6 million Ukrainian refugees out of Ukraine and then 8 million estimated Ukrainians who are displaced internal to the country is an absolute humanitarian catastrophe. War is terrible. It has so many costs that can be quantified, and I'm also thinking of all the costs that can't be quantified yet. In addition to the geopolitical drama surrounding the West propping up Ukraine and Russia being propped up by China, North Korea, and Iran, that's developing your allied and access powers. That's not good. But also the demographic toll that this is going to have on Ukraine and Russia. If you're looking at conservative numbers, 500,000 have been lost in that conflict. Well, that's like a lost generation of men and women and civilians on both Ukraine and the Russian side. I really have concerns for Ukraine as a nation in the future. Yes, rising from the ashes, but that is just human capital that is such a tremendous loss, and their future is definitely going to be impacted. Likewise, Russia and their role on the stage is going to be a lot for them to recover from as well. So my hope is that these next 7 months, as we move into this gridlock stalemate and neither side can have an explosive blow to knock the other one out, that we work really hard to get this, broker this deal, get this conflict wrapped up. But I fear it's not going to happen. Putin is not going to back down. Obviously, the Ukrainians are not going to back down. So buckle up.